around on the mobile devices, but it'll be wherever your other menu options are. So again, I'm Anna Brown. I'm here from Katie Budget Books. This is our Revenge of the Sluts Authors in Conversation event. I am just going to introduce the authors and then let them take over the show. So this evening we have Natalie Walton, the author of Revenge of the Sluts. She's been writing for as long as she can remember, completing her first book in second grade. She began posting her stories on Wattpad at the age of 14 and has since amassed over 18 million views. Natalie is a Delaware resident and wrote Revenge of the Sluts while being a full-time student at the University of Delaware, working toward her degree in sociology and criminal justice. And if you haven't picked up Revenge of the Sluts yet, it is already out. It is fabulous. She's going to tell you all about it. And she is in conversation tonight with Shafia Zaloom, who is a health educator, consultant, and author of Sex, Teens, and Everything in Between, whose work centers on human development, community building, ethics, and social justice. Her approach involves creating opportunities for students and teachers to discuss the complexities of teen culture and decision-making with straightforward, open, and honest dialogue. Shafia has worked with thousands of children and their families in her role as teacher, coach administrator, board member, and outdoor educator. Shafia is currently the health teacher at the Urban School in San Francisco and develops curricula and trainings for schools across the country. She was honored by the San Francisco Giants Foundation in 2018 for her work with Aim High, a program that expands opportunities for students from low-income neighborhoods and their teachers through tuition-free summer learning enrichment. And her work has been featured in the New York Times, USA Today, NPR, and PBS. She lives in California with her husband and 3 children. And I was blessed to have the opportunity to read her book when she was on one of our previous parenting panels, which is up on YouTube now if you guys want to see more from her. But we are so grateful to have you guys having this very important conversation with us this evening. So I'm going to hand it off to y'all.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. So we like to just launch right in and in some ways start from the beginning, because I read in the acknowledgements of Revenge of the Sluts. Sometimes I read that first because I feel like the acknowledgements can really reveal a lot about someone, and learned that Natalie has wanted to publish a book since she was 7 years old. And that dream has been realized at the springy age of, I think it's 23, which is just amazing. So could you tell us a little bit about what that experience has been like to hold the book, to have it be for real, to realize that dream that you've had for such a long time?
Yeah, it's been really surreal. I mean, I remember when I got the box of books delivered to my house, and I was like, like it was kind of a combination of, okay, now what? And then also I can't believe this is actually happening. Like I just every time I have the book next to me, and I'm just like, I can't believe my name's actually on it, and it's actually a real thing, and people can order it, or I'll have people send pictures and they'll find it in bookstores and stuff, and I'm like, that's not my book, but it totally is. So I don't know, it's really exciting. It never gets old.
Yeah, super exciting, right? To have that tangible. So much of a dream is abstract, and then when it becomes real, that's such a big deal. So kudos to you for sure. So one thing that I picked up on that I really appreciate about this book, especially as a health educator, because I feel like these are such important topics that as adults, we find a hard time approaching with kids. And they really are, they have such an appetite for conversation about this, for learning more, for information about something that's so real and relevant. So it's about revenge porn, basically the non-consensual sharing of nudes, of naked pictures. And can you talk a little, not a lot of YA authors have tackled this subject before, even though it's something that's so real and relevant to all teenagers today. If a kid has a phone, this is a very real thing for them, right? So could you talk a little bit about what inspired you to talk about this topic in particular, and maybe a little bit about your approach, because you really represent high school in such a realistic way in terms of what it looks like, sounds like, feels like through all of these characters.
Yeah, I think there's kind of 2 key parts to the book and the inspiration for the book. When I was growing up, we were kind of just starting out with things like Snapchat and Instagram, and kind of this ability to send photos to people and share kind of elements of our personal life. I mean, social media had already existed, but this was the first time that I think there were young people who really flocked to something before our parents did. I mean, I don't remember any adults who joined Instagram like immediately in my life. It was mostly teenagers who did. Um, so there was just kind of this weird disconnect. Like Snapchat was definitely marketed for kind of a younger demographic. I think young people really latched onto it, but it was also like kind of this secretive, like you can kind of just send stuff and do stuff and it all feels very private, but it's also like not private at all. So I think it was just a really kind of confusing time where nobody was really prepared on how to talk about it or talk to us about it. And it did lead to instances of, you know, revenge porn, or at least rumors of various things that were going on at our school. And it's like, I mean, this was starting as young as me being in middle school. So when I think about it, it's, you know, nobody was really prepared. I mean, we were like 12 years old. We didn't know what to do. Nobody knew who to talk to, where to go, that kind of idea. So I think that feeling of knowing that there's something going on, but not knowing the words for it, not knowing like what exactly to do, not knowing even like what adults we can tell, was a huge part of the book. And just kind of this idea of you have to tell teenagers, like you have to involve them in the conversation, like even though it makes us uncomfortable, even though nobody really wants to talk about it, like we do have to. So I think that was the biggest piece. And then um, kind of the other part of the book, and this is something that we talk about a lot of, like during this book tour, is kind of the involvement of adults in the situation and kind of like what influence they have on teenagers and their understanding of revenge porn. And a huge piece of that for me was an internship that I had with a child advocacy organization, and I was working on PowerPoint presentations for teachers. And one of the presentations that I worked on was specifically related to things like sexting and teenagers and how to handle bullying and instances when you hear rumors or when you know, hear that there's something where you might need to intervene. So that was a huge piece for me, was acknowledging that there's policy, that there's adults who are involved, that there's all these different kind of like moving parts and nobody really knows what's going on and nobody's really communicating on how to make it all work. So I wanted to try and kind of incorporate all of that into the book to the best of my ability.
I think that's what's really helpful too for kids. At least it would be to understand how all those parts come together and how they factor in, like the different dimensions of a topic that in some ways can feel so like singular, but then at the same time is intertwined with so many other things, like the topic of sexuality, right? Because I think that that's a large part of it too, is a lot of adults aren't talking openly and honestly about sexuality with young people. And when it comes to, so the vehicle through which these things are shared, right? Like Snapchat, social media platforms, things like that, where it feels like it's just under the radar and no one really knows what's going on, but everybody really knows what's going on. And then this aspect of, but there's a sexual nature to it and nobody really wants to talk about that either. And I know that you have a podcast about sex education. Could you talk about that piece and how that factored in?
Yeah, so that came much later. So when I was working actually on the editing process, like working through the editing process for Revenge of the Sluts, it really occurred to me, I guess, how strongly sex ed kind of comes into play, and this idea of talking to people and just understanding what's going on and at least like naming things for people and being able to kind of just help a little bit. I think just provide any kind of guidance. Like when I think about my sex ed experience, like there really wasn't anything, like there was nothing memorable that came out of it except kind of feelings of like guilt and just don't do it and it's going to be bad and, you know, everything like that. So I think that has always really stuck with me. And that was something that I think resonated with me from a really young age, even more strongly than I think it did with other people, which I think is where the undercurrent kind of comes in for Revenge of the Sluts. Was there are all of these different themes that I wanted to tackle, but it occurred to me kind of after everything and after I'd really thought about it and after I'd kind of spent some time in classes that it was about education more than anything. It was about being able to understand what was going on and know what steps to take and that kind of idea. So that's where the podcast kind of comes in, is I guess like a resource, like a very, very casual resource. It's just a one-on-one conversation. It's me just talking to somebody who's, so far all the guests have been about my age, and just asking them about, you know, what their sex ed experience was like, what they learned in the class, what was missing, how they learned about sex, that kind of idea. And it's just kind of to help, I think, normalize sexuality and just kind of talk about the experiences that we've had and just kind of make it feel a little kind of process almost like what we all went through with our classes and growing up, and hopefully can kind of, I think, I I don't know what the word would be. I guess almost form like a sense of community and kind of a sense of like, okay, I'm not alone in this. Like I'm not the only person who believed this totally incorrect fact about sex for a really long time because I was told something wrong, or, I'm not the only person who learned about sex from this kind of weird resource, that kind of idea. I think it's a nice kind of community bonding.
Well, and as a healthy sexuality and relationship educator, I really appreciate it because it highlights also the value of sex education. Because a lot of people have this misconception that if we talk to kids about it, they're going to go do it. And there's actually no empirical evidence whatsoever that actually proves that. In fact, the inverse is true. And in terms of the sex education in this country, yes, there are people doing amazing work. And generally speaking, it's pretty abysmal. And so parents, it really falls to parents to be, and all professional sexuality educators I know believe this, that parents are the primary sexuality educator in a child's life. So a book like this is like gold. It's a gold mine because one, it doesn't feel so cringy because it's about characters in a fiction, right? Like a fictitious story, but all of it's really real and will resonate with different kids in different ways because of the cast of characters, because it's such an accurate representation of the vibe and dynamic of high school, because of the adults that are represented. So it really provides this opportunity in which you can engage in discussions about your values, how we treat each other and how that matters. These topics about revenge porn, what consent is, sexting in particular, and where are the boundaries that surround that, and what's public and what's private, and thinking of your digital space as an extension of your personal space. Like it's so rich with themes that we can address, we need to be talking about with our children, because we know from the research and the empirical evidence that does exist that if we start to have these conversations early on in a context that's positive and comfortable and non-judgmental, but provides information and aspires to positive, good feelings, that then our kids will have more autonomy. They will pace themselves and they will make better choices that will lead to more positive, enriching relationships. So I love this because I think it's a parent's dream, and provides a really good opportunity for ongoing dialogue. Can you talk a little bit about, so no spoilers, right? Because it is a page turner, which I love about it too. I mean, from the beginning, when you had contacted me and I opened the book, I was like, okay, let me see what this is about. What does this mean? And the opening, maybe you can read that opening paragraph at some point for us. But I was like, this is going to be real. This is going to be what it's going to draw people in. So, I think that maybe we could talk a little bit about Addie, and who's the main character, and how she emerged and how much of yourself you poured into her. And how she also becomes a catalyst for some of the very education you're talking about that may have been missing from a lot of people's sex ed experience.
Yeah, I think she's a really, really interesting character, and she's an interesting choice to make the narrator. So, in theory, I view the book as being about Sloane almost as much as I imagine it being about Eden. I think it's really something where Eden is the bystander in every possible way. I mean, she's really just kind of watching all of this unfold, and I think she's really relatable in that sense. Like to me, that's who I was when I was growing up. It was somebody who sort of knows what's going on but not really, and is sort of in on the gossip but like not really, and it's high school, so everybody kind of knows what's going on, but there's different levels to it. So I think that's the biggest piece, is kind of where she fits in high school and kind of how she views herself. I think it's just a really kind of honest reflection of what it was like for me being in, kind of just growing up. I mean, I would say high school, but I think just in general. And then there's also, I think the journalism aspect is something that's really important to me. I love any sort of story about journalism and kind of finding an edge and just having this this passion for storytelling, but also this passion for kind of exploring the truth and kind of exposing things. I think there's something really powerful in particular about young journalists, so people who are in high school, and there's definitely a little bit of bias to it because I was a college journalist, so I feel like I have a lot of appreciation for kind of the art form and what it means to be on a newspaper staff. But that was a huge piece of the story too, and writing her character and trying to understand uh, just like where she was going to fit into the story and how the newspaper was going to fit in. I knew 100% I wanted that to be part of the story. It was just a matter of what that was going to be, and it ended up kind of turning into a conversation around, censorship and student responsibility and things like that, which is really, really exciting to me. I feel like you had another part of the question, but I can't remember.
No, yeah, and thank you for reminding me it's Edie, because it's Eden, so it's Edie. I always thought of her as Addie. So Edie, and then you used her in some ways, or she becomes a catalyst for certain information that we want to give kids. So it's not just like this book that drops this topic into people's laps. Like there's actually accurate information when it comes to this very topic, which I think is huge and very refreshing. But that she becomes a catalyst for some real education when it comes to this topic in particular.
Yeah, that was a really important piece for me because I don't like to be talked down to. Like I don't like that feeling of like somebody kind of preaching to me and kind of telling me exactly what I, have to do or morally where I should stand, that kind of idea. I really like that idea of being provided information and being able to kind of figure it out from there. I think we don't give teenagers enough credit for being able to figure out what's right and wrong based on context clues and based on kind of just that feeling. Like you just kind of know, I think, inherently what you should and shouldn't do. And it's just, I think for her, I wanted to make sure that she was learning alongside everyone else. So it's not that she already knew everything going in. And I think that's really realistic for a high school student. I think it's really necessary to show people who know a little bit. Like it's not something where this is completely new to her. But I think there's a lot that's still kind of missing and things she's not super familiar with. There's a scene where Ronnie is the person who defines what revenge porn even is to her. So I think it's just really important to kind of represent that even the narrator's still learning. Like she's, she has to go to people occasionally to find things out. And there's one scene in particular with a college student named Kai, who's like pretty much the only totally external character. Everything else is very much closely connected to the high school and kind of St. Joe's in general. But she's one of the few characters who's never steps foot in the school, isn't connected really in any type of way. And she is somebody who kind of fills in a lot of the gaps for Eden in terms of terminology and understanding what's going on, and also just kind of talks to her about how people, even if you're not involved, can still be affected by something, which I think is really important too. So there's a lot of like little pieces that I think are really important. And I like that feeling of having people introduce information in a way that feels realistic and doesn't feel like, okay, I need to just like make sure I'm teaching something.
Well, and it's contextual too, right? Like I think that we learn so much more. It's going to stick so much more when we have context in which to understand it. Because I know for a lot, like as a teacher, I have a lot of kids who could speak about consent in really sophisticated ways, but when it comes to actually putting it into practice and understanding what it means and how it shows up in an interpersonal dynamic, that's a whole other thing. And that's where kids are really looking for guidance in terms of like, what does that mean for me? And I think the book really inspires that kind of self-reflection to say like, which character do I resonate with in different ways as well, and what now I have this information. Oh, look at the way in which Edie actually went about finding it, right? Like, so I think it does provide a lot of clues. I love that, context clues too. I'm using that tomorrow in class. But it provides a lot of clues, right? In terms of how you actually figure something out. And that's how we teach kids to think about something versus just them knowing a definition or being able to recall words and knowledge. It's really putting it to work. And I love that aspect of it. So, just to be transparent, this isn't a question necessarily that I've talked to you about yet because it's now April and we did most of our talks in March. It's Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And that brings up the topic of consent. And what we know, and forgive me for nerding out on the science for a sec, is that when it comes to revenge porn, when it comes to social media exploitation and the non-consensual sharing of pornography or nudes, is that many times the people who are victims of that experience it through social media in the same way that they would as if it happened in person. So that the emotional and psychological impact in many ways is similar, especially if the social media exploitation continues. And that this is a really important and relevant time to be having this discussion, because there's actually so much more on the social media platforms that kids are frequenting about this topic. And so I think it's also like additional opportunity to say, as a parent, it's Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And I'm reading about all of this, and I'm seeing about all of it on social media. I know there have been, with the death of Sarah Everard in the UK, there was a huge movement that that was on social media platforms amongst young people across the country, with really staggering statistics about harassment and assault and non-consensual situations, and how we can, kids asking like, how can we do better? What do I do with this? Right. And so that's where kids really need this information. And this book is so relevant, because you can then talk about consent, not only within the context of this story, but in other realms of sexuality and teen life. So in fact, something that I think is a great idea for people with this book, and we're going to be talking about this at our school, because the month has launched a series of forums that we're having in our school, is to have a book circle. And I know Natalie is open to visiting book circles with young people who want to read her book. So it doesn't always have to be parents who are having the conversation, that you can offer and suggest the book be a part of a reading circle with someone like Natalie, a young adult who they trust, a teacher who's well loved and kids anchor themselves to in the school. Like, there's a lot of inroads using this book to having this really important conversation during such a relevant time, especially while the national discourse is discussing it so much, right? Also, it was just released that the Department of Justice and Office of Education and Civil Rights is going to be re-evaluating the Title IX guidelines that were recently, released in August, that had changed what was in place of the prior administration. Like, all these things are super relevant to our kids and their well-being. So I think that using a book like this to highlight these topics and then talk about them in real world is a phenomenal opportunity for lots of parents. Is that something you hoped for? I mean, what is it that you were really hoping people would do with the book?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was hoping would have happened. One of my very favorite things about being in social science, my background is sociology and criminal justice and political science, and pretty much everything that we do once we hit a certain point is discussion. Like, we all read something and then we all sit around and we say, basically, how did you feel about this? What personal experiences can you bring to the table, and how did those influence how you read this? And I think being able to kind of bring that down, like, I never really had that when I was in high school. I didn't really have anybody who was like, yeah, your experiences are not only valuable but totally relevant to how you read things and how you live and how you exist. I think being able to, in a kind of a small way, bring that down and say it's totally fine that how you live is going to affect how you understand things, and we can discuss that and we can start to kind of unpack that a little bit. So I think with Revenge of the Sluts, it's being able to kind of provide a way to start these conversations. So it's not only a way to kind of bring sociology to people who might not even know, like, I didn't know what sociology was when I was in high school. Being able to bring like social science topics, being able to bring like, sex ed and sexual violence and all of these different topics that adults are too afraid to kind of bring up with teenagers, kind of at a level that they might understand and be able to approach without it being like, here, I'm going to hand you a bunch of news articles, best of luck kind of idea. So I think that was really, I mean, when I think about it for this book, it's, would I rather have like a beautiful literary piece, or would I rather have something that can be like a discussion starter? I would definitely pick kind of discussion starter. Like, I think my social science background came through really strongly when I was writing this, and that's really, I think, where my heart lies in a lot of ways, is being able to, I think, teach in really kind of interesting ways, or at least have just, I don't even like like an older sister kind of feel, even if it's not formally teaching. It's more of like, okay, here's some information, here's some guidance, here's people that you can connect to or understand or learn from. Go on your way and kind of, figure it out from there.
And there's options, which is what I sort of love, which I love about it too, that especially amongst the girls who have been exploited, where, it's shown that different people respond to trauma in different ways. People with different contexts, then that does determine, right, that how they're going to have an emotional embodied experience. And then what people do with sadness and anger, feeling betrayed, all those different things. But then also how you can be an ally. I love that about the book, because so much of the time we focus on these moments of like, who, the survivor and the perpetrator, but we don't recognize that there's a whole host of context that's really important to talk about, because usually, there's kids on the outside who are bystanders, who can be allies, who can stand up for what's right, who can be the voice of some who, as long as it's consensual, who may not be able to exercise their voice in a moment. I love the character of Atticus. There's also diverse representation of boys in this book that I think is incredibly important, and how they role model different ways of approaching this conversation, different ways they may be a part of what's happened or not. And how their decisions then will either be helpful and supportive in creating a shift and change for the better, or just sort of feed this undercurrent of negativity. And so, there's something in it for everyone. Have you had many boys show an interest in the book, or does it tend to mostly be about girls?
Yeah, it's definitely mostly, I think, leaning women and girls. I would love to see more, like, particularly teenage boys, I think, reading this book. I would love to be part of discussions with them. I honestly would be really interested, too, to hear kind of, I mean, any age group would be wonderful, but like college students, like male college students in particular, would be, I think, really, really interesting. I came in to speak for a college level class, and it was all women who were in it, but we were talking kind of about their experiences and what it felt like thinking back on high school and reflecting on it. And I think it would be really, really interesting to have that opportunity with male students in particular. I think there would be some really kind of interesting reflection that would come out of it. But yeah, no, I would definitely love to see more like men who are engaging with the book. It's just kind of, I feel like being able to hear their insight would be really, really valuable for me too, just kind of understanding how I can write about men and anything else that I can kind of add in and explore. And I don't know, it's part of the experience. Like for me, being able to hear from readers is learning, like it's a part of the writing process and understanding kind of how the world works. Like I kind of view it almost as like a mini kind of experiment. It's like any sort of stories or any reviews that people are sharing. It's helpful for me being able to understand kind of what I can do better or what I can do differently, or even if there's like certain topics or themes that I want to integrate into later work, that kind of idea.
Well, dads in particular, I'd actually love to do a book group with dads reading this book. I think that would be huge, because it's really gendered in terms of if parents are talking to kids, who's doing most of the talking to them. And that's actually a really important aspect of the conversation, is that it's shared, that responsibility is shared. If there's two people in the household, that both partners are speaking to their kids about it, for sure. So let's talk a little bit about the title. It's certainly catchy, and that's also an issue right now amongst teenagers, this sort of reclaiming of language, right? It has been for a while, with different language having to do with derogatory terms, whether they be grounded in racism or, like anti-Semitism. Like there's all kinds of queer. If we're talking about sexuality, is another word that we're reclaiming. Like, can you talk about the slut piece a little bit for us?
Yeah, what's funny is I came up with this title, like it was the first part of the book that I came up with. Like I just kind of had this feeling of like, what if I did this? Like, would that be ridiculous? And I came up with the title when I was like 12 years old, and it just always really stuck with me as this like possible kind of thing that I wanted to do, but I didn't know what to do with it. And I just, when I think about that now and when I kind of reflect on it, it's really interesting to me that I was so kind of unafraid of using the word slut. And like, it wasn't something where I was like necessarily shy about it. And I don't, like, I'm not really sure what the secret was. Like, I'm not sure like where my feeling was coming from, where I was like, yeah, this will be like funny and interesting and like really catch people's attention. Like, it wasn't something where I was worried about necessarily like offending people. And it's, what's really interesting too is, I mean, we're taught to really fear the word. Like, that wasn't something that I was even immune to. Like, it was something where growing up, it's, you know, you don't want to be called a slut. You also don't want to be called a prude. And you have to figure out where you're going to fall in the middle of that. And it's just, I don't know. I really, for some reason, I always felt really strongly about the word slut just being totally ridiculous. And I think that's where it came from. It was this feeling of like, even from a young age, being kind of like, why are we so afraid of this? Like, what, who started this and why kind of idea? And, you know, it's definitely evolved from there and kind of just understanding like why are we, like why, it's just, I feel like I've been spending so much time trying to figure that out and kind of what to do with that and how we can combat that. And I think the biggest piece is reclaiming. I mean, it's not something where I would ever force it upon people. And even for myself, I'm like, I don't know necessarily how far I'd go with certain words, but it's, if I very strongly stand by, if there's a word that really resonates with somebody, like 100%, like take it back. Like the word slut, all of the girls in the book who are called sluts have said, this is who I am. Like, this is a title that's comfortable to me. And I think that's the most important piece, is that all of the girls in the book say, this is something I feel comfortable with, and I want to be calling myself this, and I'm the person who's going to call myself that kind of idea.
So when we weaponize language, right, like how we then respond in a way that tries to diminish the power that someone has put behind the language to demean or to make smaller, minimize somebody in some way, for sure. Interesting. I mean, it's an interesting topic too, and I think it's really a good one for families to have in terms of family values. And I think there's a generational piece to that too. And I think a lot of it also depends on like who's reclaiming and how it's still used and who's using it and in what way and contextually, because it's not just what we say, but how we say it. I know there's actually a lot of language too that's been normalized. And sometimes I wonder like, oh, is it because it's being reclaimed, or is it because it's so normalized that we've actually internalized this sexist language that we're now using amongst each other? And that when we use it amongst each other, does that then give permission to other people to use it with us? So all of that, I think, is really important dialogue, where we reveal meaning to our kids and what we value, and to ask genuine questions around that and what they think and feel, because I hear it all the time amongst kids, lots of different types of language, and wanting to reclaim, really trying to figure out who has permission to use it and who doesn't, and in what context, all that sort of stuff. So, you know, good conversations to have, and in a way that we suspend judgment, but really be genuinely curious and allow kids to be experts in their own experience, to say like, yeah, this is what I know, because they have a power we don't, and that's to know what the kids are doing when the adults aren't around. And so if we want them to share with open honesty, we can't slam them for what they share with us. We have to actually listen and engage with genuine curiosity and no judgment. Okay, so we have this very catchy title. I'd love to transition to see if we have any questions in the chat at this point. Since we've been talking for a while, have there been any audience questions at all?
We do have a couple of questions so far. The first is 12 too young to read this book with?
I know. Yeah, I think the recommendation is about 14. I think that's maybe the base level that my publisher said. Shafia's more familiar, I think, with like development and just where teenagers would be and what they'd be able to understand. But yeah, I mean, I think most of it depends on like, I guess, the maturity level and kind of where you fall in that and what kind of discussion you think you'd be able to have. But yeah, I think 14 is like, I would say like early high school, maybe even like late middle school would definitely be, I think, like the starting point and probably about what I would recommend. But I think Shafia will have a better idea.
I mean, there's chronological age, right? And then there's sort of our developmental stage, and then there's maturity. So those are all things to take into account when trying to decide like what's the appropriate age that you would share in this, this book or in this read with your kid. I think that because the context is high school, that's a really good guideline. But sexting and things like that, solicitation of nudes, texting, things like that actually starts later middle school. So, it really, birth order has something to do with it too. Like my first kid relative to my third kid, I mean, such a different sort of exposure and ability or sophistication when it comes to sort of pop culture in the world that I want to be talking about earlier than I would have ever with that first kid. So I think there are a lot of different things that will factor into that. Ultimately, I think it's an intuitive decision. So, I would read the book first and then decide for yourself. And you can read the book and, given the themes in the book, then ask questions, not interrogate, but ask questions. I'm thinking about reading this book with you. I think it's really good. I want to make sure it's age appropriate. Are you exposed to things like sexting? Do you know what sexting is? Do you have friends who are being asked to do this sort of thing? And use that as a gauge. So you're actually using your kid to determine if they're ready or not to read this with you, versus like trying to figure this out for yourself with all these algorithms and then making that decision. I would definitely include them in the process, but in a way that's exploratory, because you're also setting the stage for future conversations versus like interrogating them, kind of thing. Is this happening? We need to talk about it. This is the book that we're going to do it with, right? Like that's not the approach we want, but rather, I'm reading this book. These are the things that have come up. Do you feel like this is relevant to your experience yet? Are these things that you see happening at school or amongst your friends or in your space? Have you heard of this language before, right? Like just get genuinely curious and become practiced in asking these kind of, non-judgmental questions. I notice, how, what, when, stay away from why. The second you lead with why, you've already made a judgment. Kids have a radar that will pick up on that immediately. Really become genuinely curious, and treat them as if they are experts in their own experience, and honor and believe in that. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, the next question, well, actually, the original asker commented while you were speaking and said, thank you so much. That is perfect. I will read first and ask the questions, not interrogate. And then the next question is kind of a writing process question. So what was the process like in developing each character and finding their individual voices? Were there any major edits to the characters from the time you initially wrote the idea down to the published novel?
Yeah, the characters went through a lot. They started off in kind of interesting places. When I first was writing the book, I had a full outline and I had kind of a list of characters I was working with. I knew from the very beginning it was going to be kind of like a large ensemble book. Like I knew that there was just no possible way I could write this book without it having a fairly large cast of weirdly connected and interconnected people. But they definitely all went through various stages of development. I think Sloane was probably the most fully formed from the very beginning. But I mean, even like writing about Eden or understanding, like even somebody like Luke was a little bit difficult and definitely changed over time as the book developed and as the plot developed and things like that. I would kind of let the characters almost decide for themselves who they were going to be based on the scenes and where I felt like they fit in best. And I think that kind of organic approach really helped me figure out what I wanted to say with the book, and things would come out and I'd be like, oh, that's a really interesting point. Like, let me explore that a little bit more, and, various things like that. So, but yeah, I think Atticus probably went through the biggest jump because I always knew I wanted to write something with him, but he was a little bit difficult for me to figure out. So it took some time to get there, but I have such a soft spot for him and kind of the discussions that I think he could be part of and things like that. So yeah, it's they definitely did not come out fully formed. There's a lot of editing and a lot of working and a lot of, messaging my editor and figuring out what exactly I wanted to say with different things.
Okay, and then kind of a related question, and you touched on this earlier, but the male voices. One of the things I loved is that it felt like there were kind of males from all possible angles on this issue, like guys that just sort of hadn't thought about it, and guys that were involved, and guys that weren't involved at all. And how was that difficult for you to write from? Did you like talk to some men to figure out sort of authentically what that would be like?
What's really interesting is it felt very natural to me. I think part of it was growing up and kind of like I have brothers, like I have male friends, like I kind of understood what the conversations were like growing up. And I feel like in a lot of ways, I fell in that kind of Eden role of observing a lot of people and kind of watching what was going on and hearing various things and being like, that's interesting, but I don't know what to do with that. But that's an interesting thing that somebody just said, kind of idea. And I think it felt very natural, kind of exploring it. And it's also just, I think with my background in sociology at the time that I was writing it and just all the different classes I'd taken, it was a whole combination of things where I felt generally pretty comfortable, I think, exploring the fact that men are going to respond differently to these instances and men fit into these like, social hierarchy in the same way that women do. Like, I don't think we talk about men in popularity nearly as much as we talk about women in popularity and this idea of fitting in and this desire to be accepted by people, and kind of doing whatever it takes to feel like you're in with the crowd kind of idea. So that was kind of a big piece of it. And I think it's it's definitely not like the biggest part of the book, but it's something that really resonates with me and it's something that I take a lot of pride in.
Can I also piggyback on that question to ask? We've talked about before, and I think it's really inspiring and helpful. Like, it's huge. It's such a huge accomplishment that at 23, you have published a book. This has been your dream and you've done it. For young aspiring writers, do you have any words of wisdom or advice for them in terms of how to persist and realize their dreams?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest piece of it is like just keep going for it. Like when people say like write what you know, they're being very genuine about it and it's not necessarily write what you know in the sense of you have to write about yourself and people who look like you and people who act like you and it's exactly who you are. It's more, I think it's more nuanced than that. It's about experiences and it's about things that you see. Like for me, writing what I knew meant writing about what it felt like being a high schooler with access to technology. Like that's where my experience came in and that's where my understanding came in. So I think there's something really powerful about what we've seen and what we experience and it's very individualized. And I feel like there's a piece to that I was going to talk about and now I can't remember. But yeah, I feel like that's the biggest thing is it's okay to write what you know. Oh, and it's also okay to use writing as a way of like catharsis and kind of exploring your feelings about things. I definitely used writing as kind of almost like a diary and a way of exploring what's going on in the world and what I'm seeing and hearing and what my feelings are. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If anything, I think it provides a great outlet. It's very healthy. It was, there's a lot of rage that went into Revenge of the Sluts, and I think it was really good for me.
Well, and then the other part of it too, I think you've spoken about this before, is that you don't be unafraid. Like, it's okay to write drafts and to rewrite them and to get edits, and that when someone critiques and it's not a criticism, it's merely just a way to think about your writing from a different perspective or whatever else, that to be kind and generous with yourself as a writer and to be patient. And that it happens through a lot of practice and drafting and all that sort of stuff, that it doesn't just magically happen and boom, at 23, you're a published author. That there's a lot that goes into it.
I have so many different drafts and ideas and outlines and various things. I mean, the version of the book that I first wrote, there's a lot of similarities to what got published, but there's a lot of stuff that didn't stick. And there's a lot of things that, I mean, in terms of plotting, in terms of characters, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that changes. And I think that's totally natural and totally healthy. And it's the same idea with taking advice and criticism and understanding what is a critique and what's helpful versus what's not. I think it's like the most important skill that you can possibly learn. And it's being able to understand when something is a conversation and when it's a way to kind of learn. Like, I think one of my favorite pieces of advice like ever was being taught that like interviews are just a conversation. And in the same way, I view things like, you know, being told, okay, here's a note from your editor, like, what are you going to do with it kind of idea. It's understanding what you can ask questions on, and it's worth exploring, and what you actually want to do with your book. I don't know. I think once you start viewing the editing process as something that's just a conversation about the book and kind of a way of being better, it helps a little bit. Like, it doesn't totally ease the pain of somebody coming in and being like, okay, we need to fix like this, and this, and it's all, you know, huge parts of the book. But it, I think, helps a little bit, and I think it's made me a better writer.
Yeah, it's an opportunity to stretch and grow. And I'm old, you know, it took me to over 20 years to get my book out, and I write articles and things like that, you know, and when I get stuff back from the editor, and there's all kinds of, you know, edits and different things, and 3 people have looked at it, and it's such a mess. And, you know, I have to take a deep breath, and I have to tell myself, like, this is an opportunity to stretch and grow, and it's going to make it better. And it's a collaboration. It's not just, you know, one person and whatever else it is, that we all stand on the shoulders of others. And that's really a beautiful thing, that we have that opportunity and community that surrounds us, so that we can all evolve, right, through each other, in different ways. But yeah, no, it's tough. The little, like, the invasive voice, right? Like, that comes in, the little gremlin in your ear that starts to say whatever, like, shoo it away. We all experience that. It's totally normal. And it's really important to create your counter narrative, and just keep doing what you're doing, and write what you know, and have faith in that, for sure.
And that kind of ties into a question for me. So I am just old enough to not be entirely familiar with Wattpad. I know that it exists, but my impression has been that maybe there's some interaction there. And I know we have some parents in the audience tonight. So if their teens are looking into starting writing, I know some of them are probably in the same position I'm in, where they know Wattpad is out there, but maybe have questions about what that's like if their teens are getting onto it.
Yeah, no, I would compare it to basically the equivalent of like somebody posting their music on like YouTube or something like that. So it's kind of this ability to like share things in a very, very early draft and kind of receive feedback. So having people who can come in and comment. And I mean, it really depends because it's random on the internet who just like happen to find your things. So it's like, you know, sometimes you'll get comments that are, you know, like very specific, very helpful. We'll say, okay, I really like this about your plotting, or I didn't like this about this character, or this didn't make any sense to me. Or sometimes just get comments that are like, this is really cool. And like either way, I think it's helpful. Like I think it's good to be able to get into the mind of a reader. And I think actually starting off as young as I did, I think I joined when I was maybe 12 or 13. And it's when I think about it, it really did help with my writing and my understanding that people are actually going to be reading what I'm writing, and understanding how to kind of work with the market and how to balance what people are going to say about my writing, because not everyone's always going to like what I have to say, and trying to understand what's valuable to me and what I want to write about versus kind of what I think I should write about versus what I think people are going to want to read, that kind of idea. So I think it helped me really kind of develop my own voice, being able to have people who are in who are about my age who are like, this sucks or this is really good, and like, you know, figuring out what that means for me in my writing and things like that. So yeah, I highly recommend, especially for people who might be a little bit shy about sharing their stuff. Like for me, I have no sort of like qualms about like sharing my writing with strangers. Like I'll post it anywhere. I'll talk to anybody about my writing. It doesn't matter to me. But when it comes to like family and friends, or like having some sort of like group where I have to like look at the person who's offering criticism, I struggle with that a lot. So that was something that was really helpful for me too, where I was like, I don't want to share this with my parents, but like I do want to talk to people about it. So Wattpad was the perfect kind of way for me to do that. And I still keep up with friends I've known on there for like, you know, 7 or 8 years at this point. We all have like a writers group chat and stuff like that. So it's not only just a way of like having basically like early beta readers, it's also a way of meeting people who 100% understand me and understand what I'm going through and what it feels like to like write a novel at the age of like 17.
are you working on anything new now? Or are you kind of taking a break? Are you allowed to talk about it? I know sometimes you're not allowed to talk about.
No, I'm just kind of like, I have some stuff on the back burner that I'm working on. I definitely want to keep on this kind of rip from the headlines, social science, young adult angle. I don't have like, I wish I had something more concrete to share, but at this point it's just kind of like, that's the direction I'm hoping to go in. There's a whole bunch of stuff that I want to write about, just in a very broad sense. There's always things that are coming out in the news. There's always new ways of talking about gender and sexuality that I want to explore in interesting ways. So hopefully there will be something new. Hopefully something concrete will come out of this eventually. But like I am working on things, and I'm hoping Revenge of the Sluts will not be like a one-off for me.
Okay, and then one of the things that comes up in your book um, is the state law where they're at regarding revenge porn, and it goes into that kind of a lot, and also about the fact that it's not the same everywhere. So I assume you did some research into that. Is there, and Shafia, you may be able to answer this also, is there a place where teens can go to find out that information for their own states?
Yeah, it's I would say the biggest resource for me, Shafia probably will know more, but I know for me a huge resource was the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. So CCRI was really, really helpful as like a starting point. I really trust kind of what they've found and the research that they do. It basically is just, it's more from a like a legal standpoint, so it can be a little bit heavy. Like it's a little bit difficult to kind of wade through. But there was a website that I looked at that broke it down very explicitly state by state. I wish I could remember. I think it might be, there's a official Revenge of the Sluts website, and I tried to put a whole bunch of resources on there. So that might be a good place to start too. But yeah, no, it's understanding the different laws and kind of, I mean, the universal is that if you are under the age of 18, you cannot be sending nudes. Like that's the hard rule basically everywhere. You're not going to find any real leeway with that. It's just a matter of how tough the judge is going to be in a certain situation. But yeah, otherwise it gets a little bit complicated with who's going to be punished and how. And that was actually, the book was originally based in Pennsylvania, which is a little bit closer to Delaware than Massachusetts is. But because of their revenge porn laws, I actually had to change the location of the book because the book would have been, I think, a little bit different had it taken place in Pennsylvania, which is interesting to think.
Yeah, teen sexting laws, a really good resource too is RAINN, RAINN, and they will have each state listed, and it will tell you sort of what their laws are in regards to like, the non-consensual sharing of pornography or trafficking in child pornography. And so that language is a little misleading, which is why some states actually have teen sexting laws. So, there's the federal law, which says that anybody under the age of 18 who takes a picture of themselves, who shares a picture, who forwards a picture, who receives a picture, accepts it and keeps it in their phone, that's actually trafficking in child pornography. So there's the federal law, and we all know that states have different statutes, and that when it comes to criminal justice, the federal, the United States, the federal government and the state governments actually share that responsibility. And so, each state has its own statutes in regards to different aspects of sexting too. Like there's sextortion, there's, revenge porn or the non-consensual sharing, there's actually trafficking in child pornography. And some states have come up with their specific teen sexting laws because they understand they're not in the criminal justice system is not interested in criminalizing young people. They want to have those laws in place, and they should, because there are adults who are actually exploiting young children in this way, right? So it recognizes a difference. And because then if you are tried in juvenile court, which the focus of which is typically on, or hopefully on, rehabilitation, then the consequences are less severe, right? Versus if you're tried as an adult in some sort of federal court, then the consequences for that could be really severe. So, there's some complexity to it. It would be in everybody's best interest to actually educate themselves on the statutes and laws in your own specific state on a variety of topics that have to do with consent and sexuality and how that may impact your child. The other part of it is this stuff is very frequent, and there are some professionals who believe we should actually talk to kids about how to sext without violating the law. And that's controversial, right? Because we don't want kids to sext. We want them sexed. We want them to like connect authentically and all that sort of stuff. And these are digital natives. And this is the way they connect and communicate for a lot of them, is through digital devices. So really thinking about what your values are, what you want to communicate to your kid. People also ask me, well, what constitutes a sexually explicit photo? So for police officers or detectives, for instance, whose whole, department is focused on this very topic, they will say anything that shows within a sexual context that would typically be covered by a bathing suit. And so how kids get around that, for instance, putting little emojis on nipples, like there's all sorts of stuff that revolves around this. And so I think the first step is educating yourself on the laws and statutes specific to your state. You can go to the DOJ website and actually understand what the federal law is. And then it's really about your kid and the landscape they're navigating socially. So, again, becoming curious, suspending judgment. I wrote an article for Girls Leadership specifically that's on my website that actually breaks it all down in terms of sexting and nudes and pictures too that boys will send, like what are called dick pics, that sort of talks about all those different things and the different tools kids need in addition to the proverbial hammer, right? Like, so if they are going to sext, how can they handle that? If someone sends them a picture, how do they, or asks for a picture, how can they handle that? Beyond just saying no, because that's not actually realistic for a lot of kids, because they're not saying no to the ask, they're saying no to the person who's doing the asking. And depending on the social currency that person has in that kid's social landscape, it's going to be a very different thing. So I talk about it in my book too. But if you just want a quick read of an article, there's one there. But yeah, so there's a lot to this topic. It's very meaty.
All right. Well, thank you, ladies, so much for joining us this evening. I'm just going to do a quick plug again for both of your books because I am the parent of a current teenager and two little ones that will one day be teenagers. And both of these books are flawless, which I do not say lightly. Revenge of the Sluts, I was a little nervous about fiction about this topic because it's loaded, right? But Natalie, you have done such a fabulous job of kind of encompassing all angles and making sure we sort of see all perspectives where, like, except for the obvious guy that was out, a person who was out to hurt someone, that there are all these other layers of people that maybe just don't think about the ongoing consequences of their actions and like how important education is. And it was just so incredible to see it handled so in depth and not feel like being lectured to, right? It was a great read. It was kind of a mystery, which I loved, because we're trying to figure out what happened from the very beginning. And I loved it so much. And it just was all encompassing, fabulous read, which is a parent, like I'm pawning off on my teenager now so that he will read it. It'll take some hammering with him. He's not much of a reader, but he's going to read it so we can talk about it. And Shafia, I loved your book so much. I have already loved on your book in a previous panel, but so the attendees tonight can hear it too. It is so great because it's the kind of book you can both hand to a teenager and sort of let them read through. The way that it's written is appropriate for both parents or teens. So as a parent, I found it very informative for like the questions I didn't even know that maybe I should be discussing with my teenager because things have changed since I was a teenager. But it's also something that I can kind of give to my teenager as a resource. So for the conversations he doesn't want to have with me, that I keep kind of trying to approach because it's important, but that I don't want to make him so uncomfortable he doesn't want to talk to me at all. He still kind of has a resource that's written in a way that's palatable for him too, to look at some of those nuances that maybe, as much as I try, I just cannot be completely familiar with because it didn't exist when I was going through that stage of my life. So there is a link in the chat for where you can still purchase both of those books from us because they're amazing for both parents and teens, both of them. So thank you, ladies, so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, attendees, for coming. It was a fabulous chat.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Everybody have a good night.